Hello, my name is Madeline McCormack, and this is my current event assignment for Texas Government 2306. This presentation, I'm going to go over prisoner treatment and how they are given minimal care, denied access to mental health services, and how people are dying due to Texas's current heat wave. The Texas Justice Initiative says that there has been 13,167 deaths in custody in Texas since 2005. In 2022, there were 913 inmate deaths recorded, and there are already 419 deaths recorded for 2023. Of these deaths, 42% were white, 29% were black, 28% were Hispanic, and 1% the race was not given. For age, 30% were 60 or older, 25% were 50 to 59 years old, 19% were 40 to 49, 14% was for 30 to 39 years old, 11% was 18 to 29 years old, and 1% was under the age of 18. Of this, 94% of those deaths were male. So 66% of these deaths were labeled as natural causes or illness. Inmates are often denied health care until deemed absolutely necessary, and by then it is too late. 51% of deaths actually occur at medical facilities. If prisoners were taken earlier, their stories would not be cut so short and they could have been given the care they needed. 12% of deaths were by homicide, 11% by suicide. According to the recorded number of inmate deaths in 2022 of 913 inmate deaths, this means approximately 100 inmates committed suicide in Texas custody last year. 65% of inmates who died were in prison, 19% were in police custody, and 14% were in a county jail. What is different while inmates are in prison that increase the death rate so drastically? Well, prison accommodates people for a longer period of time, but how are these inmates treated while they're in there? Texas death row prisoners say that they spend decades in solitary confinement. They are kept in isolation until their execution dates with little human contact, medical care, or legal help. These prisoners have filed a lawsuit against Texas stating it's unconstitutional to hold them in solitary confinement with minimal health and psychiatric care with little resources to seek help. On death row, the prisoner is alone in their cell for 22 to 24 hours a day, which even violates the state's policy on how often they're supposed to be let out. The lawsuit claims that extended isolation deprives the prisoners of their right to access medical care and their attorneys, and it causes them severe physical and psychological harm. Psychiatric studies show that solitary confinement can cause long-lasting damage, especially to those with a pre-existing mental illness. 8 death row prisoners have died by suicide in the last 20 years in Texas, with the most recent suicide being in January of 2023. This was Terrence Andreas, age 34. He had been on death row for nearly a decade after being convicted of killing 2 people in Fort Bend County during an unsuccessful carjacking attempt in 2008. This means that Andreas experienced 15 years of solitary confinement. Catherine Braddock, a Houston attorney with the firm, says, Texas death row conditions have been described as the most inhumane in the country, and we obviously have a large death row population. Texas prisoners complain that the conditions on death row violate the U.S. Constitution's 8th Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment. The complaint states that the death sentence inmates are put in solitary confinement solely based on their sentence, but not because of their crime or their prison behavior. Another major concern is the heat wave that is currently in Texas. Between July 10th and July 20th, Austin has had 11 days in a row of temperatures reaching above 105 degrees. There has been 9 inmates who have died of reported heart attacks or unknown causes in prisons that lack air conditioning in the summer of 2023. It's been 11 years since the state last classified a prisoner death as heat-related, and the state continues to refuse to say that these deaths were due to the heat wave. The state of Texas has said that it's almost impossible to know if someone has died from a heat stroke or if it is just from underlying cardiac conditions. A lot of these people who have died from a heat stroke in prisons often just get the cause of death as cardiac arrest or just unknown. A lot of Texas has been experiencing this crazy heat wave we've been having, and specifically in Huntsville, Texas, they have been having very high temperatures. Tommy McCalla was living in Huntsville, Texas, and he was residing in their prison. He was mowing the fields outside of the Gorey unit when he had collapsed. The prison reported that his cause of death was to be cardiac arrest. He was only 35 years old. McCullough was one of at least 5 prisoners since mid-June of 2023 to be reported to have had a heart attack or cardiac arrest and died. All of these prisoners resided in a prison without air conditioning. Another man died the same week in a separate Huntsville prison, and he was only 34 years old. Texas Department of Criminal Justice spokesperson Amanda Hernandez says, "It is not immediately clear how much of a role, if any, the heat played in the 9 deaths. Like all prison deaths, they're being investigated. Labeling these as heat-related before the investigation is complete would be inaccurate," she says. More than 2/3 of Texas's 100 prisons don't have air conditioning. Thousands of officers and tens of thousands of prisoners are cramped inside concrete and steel buildings without ventilation, without circulation, and without air conditioning. On top of this, there has been severe staff shortages with a ratio for 1 officer to every 7 prisoners. This causes inmates to receive less time outdoors and more times cramped in their hot cells. This year, 2023, state lawmakers chose again not to put any money directly towards installing air conditioning in the dangerously hot prisons, despite having a $32.7 billion budget surplus. Christy Williams, McCallow's sister, said her brother had called and told a friend on the phone the night before he died that the officers hadn't been bringing him water. This had been a common complaint among Texas prisoners to their families in the last several weeks as temperatures began to increase. According to prison records, McCallow was serving a 5-year sentence for drug possession out of Collin County, and he was set to be released in early of 2026. There is a large amount of studies linking an increase in fatal heart failure to extreme heat. Dr. Salil Bhandari, an emergency medicine physician at UT Health Houston and Memorial Hermann, explained there is always an increase in cardiac arrest during heat waves. Heat stroke alone can lead to cardiac arrests. Bhandari says, "Heat stroke essentially means they are to the point where they are now having some sort of organ damage. If the heart is not getting enough blood, it will lead to cardiac arrest." He further goes on saying, "It is hard to identify heat as the cause of death, even when looking at someone in an autopsy." There has been a years-long civil rights lawsuit against Texas over the heat and lack of air conditioning in a geriatric prison. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice began to implement measures to fight against the heat, such as providing prisoners with personal fans, access to ice water, cold showers, and giving time in air-conditioned areas. Officials also began moving out prisoners with heart problems and those on certain medications, and they moved them into air-conditioned units. Regardless of these measures attempted by the Department of Criminal Justice, prisoners say the policies aren't followed. A study by Texas Prisons Community Advocates and the Texas A&M University Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center surveyed hundreds of prisoners between 2018 and 2020. They found that many reported there was minimal relief and lack of access to the required policies set by the Department of Criminal Justice. As I mentioned before, the prison system has not counted deaths related to heat since 2012. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice has been fighting a large number of wrongful death lawsuits, and the civil rights case filed against the PAC unit forced the Department of Criminal Justice in 2018 to agree to install an air conditioner inside the geriatric prison. There is evidence that deaths have been connected to the heat, even if the Texas Department of Criminal Justice does not acknowledge them. On June 20th, 2023, 2 men died of cardiac arrest in Huntsville and in Beaumont. Randy Butler, age 34, lived on the Byrd unit and reportedly died of cardiac arrest after a day when the area heat index reached 114 degrees. Michael Dixon, age 69, was found unresponsive in his Stiles unit cell as the temperature fell about 108 degrees. On June 23, 2023, the same day McCullough died, 73-year-old Jerry Jernigan also died of a reported heart attack at the Smith unit in West Texas, where temperatures reached 102 degrees. The House has agreed to spend $545 million to cover 2 phases of a 4-phase plan to install air conditioning in all Texas prisons by 2031. Despite the much-needed plan, the Texas Senate denied the plan. The final budget, which goes into effect in September of 2023, will instead give the Texas Department of Criminal Justice $85.7 million for additional deferred projects, which will likely be used to install some air conditioning in prisons. The lack of healthcare, psychiatric resources, and lack of air conditioning is a big governmental issue that causes a threat to prisoners' safety, well-being, and lives. The government continues to show a lack of urgency in providing these prisoners air conditioning in these hot months. Being a Texas prisoner poses a threat to those going into the system. Regardless of crime, all prisoners deserve the same rights deemed to them under the Constitution. Thank you for listening.